But first, let me just, I mean, so this is Kitelo, Peter Kitelo Kachongewa from the Ogiek of Chepkatali, Mount Elgin in Kenya, who was with us on Monday and responded to Milka Chepkorea's presentation on the Sengwe then, and Colin Scott, anthropologist from McGill in Canada, who's worked for many years with the James Bay Cree of northern Quebec and the Torres Strait Islanders in northern Queensland. And they both know each other, and they both know Chris, and both know me, and yeah, and we've been together, I guess, in the struggle to try and help communities stay on their lands rather than be evicted from their lands, and to try and have recognition of communities' ability to take care of themselves and their lands rather than have that turned against them. And I was just asking Kitelo a question about, we were looking at how the theme of this session about navigating empowerment and cooptation, how when you assert your rights and you try and get somewhere, you can then have that used against you as well. And there's then a tricky negotiation within the community. And so I guess I wanted just to ask Kitelo, just on that one, both this question about the way in which the conservation agenda and the kind of climate change agenda is used against communities like you. So what should be a good agenda is then turned against you, but also when you have divisions within the community around this, when some people get caught up in these kind of extractive processes.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much, Justin, and thanks for the introduction. Maybe I would like to know, what is the sense of time I should take?
I was thinking you just take a moment, then Colin has woken up, can give his presentation, right. Then you have a time to respond.
No problem. Yeah,
you can play it either way, whichever.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Because I realized I'm losing the sense of time, because I normally plan myself. And then once I've planned myself very well, there's many things that come that normally take my time. So it is good to, yeah. But I think there is one thing that misses in that state. When I looked at the, the empowerment, co-option, there's another one that I don't have a word for it, which is, and I will give it with an example, for example. And this is like for us, like our people like ourselves who have had to endure the colonial system that was generated here. And that is, and I'll bring it from the conservation and looking at organizations like WWF, for example, which good people like all of us here, all of you here, could easily be contributing to the funds of organizations like WWF, who are using the same funds in things that if you knew they were doing it, you would not contribute. I think it works. It really, that is the other. I thought that is the third one that that would work very well. That is empowerment, co-option, and this one that I'm bringing about, which I don't have a good word for. I think they work together. And maybe I will go to the. I will start with the third one, because that is the most active at the moment, which is the excuse. Already the excuse of conservation is there. And everyone, for communities like ours, and just a small introduction, our community, we lost all our lands to all the conservation categories in Kenya. We lost to forest reserve, we lost to national park, and most recently we lost to game reserve. And then to crown it on all of it, there is a new one they call a water tower. All these are conservation, because it comes about, like the last one is about conservation of water. Now, organizations like WWF, I'm just using the example, but there are many others, are, getting support to support initiatives of conservation in the sense of conservation. But if you look at what really happens is that they are supporting, first of all, the model that has failed. But again, they are also really doing something that will be done for many years and it will not succeed. They are not supporting the initiatives that have always been there, as in it has set up, this is a system that has set up those that would want or have been genuinely conserving some of these areas, and the system that they stand up against, which is a system of dispossession. And for us, it's there is, you know, clearing. It's very clear for us, because the areas that have been taken away from us completely have been, some were taken away for, you know, farms, but others were taken away for commercial production of wood. That means, you know, planting of cypress, you know, and yet, you know, that is conservation. So there's that. I say that is the third one that works with this, and I don't have a word. But the idea of empowerment and co-option is a struggle. Is a struggle for indigenous peoples. Is a struggle that we come across each and every other day, and it is a struggle. And for our case, for example, or the cases I've seen, the empowerment is done to weaken the struggles of indigenous communities. It's not done to, you know, in a genuine way. Maybe I would like to hear what Colin's, the examples of Colin's from the Cree, but for ours, is done, and the ones that I've seen I've interacted to in Kenya, maybe, and other African countries, DRC, are those with the, I can still use the example I had, which is an organization like WWF will go to a community, get some part. There is also poverty, for example, in many of the communities. I mean, contributed by the dispossession that they've gone through for the many years. And also, there is the system of education, which comes with this, whereby people are taught that, you know, conservation is to be done in one way. And all of us are faced it, including myself, because I had the chance of studying. But when you, after some time, then you start challenging some of the things that are taken or are taught outside there to look like, you know, that is, you know, like in Kenya, for example, at no time in my studies did I hear or was taught about community conservation, for example. Community conservation is seen as a problem, although it is catching up. It's catching up, like in Kenya, just to give an example why it's catching up. In 2016, our Forest Conservation and Management Act recognized community forest. You can imagine, 2016 is when you have community forest, while we've been having private forests and call it public forest. And public forest, we all know what it means. How these, looking at the empowerment aspect, looking at it, for example, it comes to communities and say, okay, we want to do this. A common one is called livelihoods, for example. And this is, in most cases, is livelihoods that would discourage people from sustainably using the resources they've been using. So basically removing them from what they've been doing, because or call it, actually the right word would be trying to buy off communities. And it's not sustainable. And it really tries to disconnect land or resources and communities, so that with the time, communities, the hope, I think, of course, that is not put in black and white, but the hope is to make sure that after some time, communities do not have the need or do not get completely disconnected from their their lands.
So
and then co-option, I would summarize the co-option very easily. And we have in Kenya, in Kenya also, I have we work together with other indigenous communities, including forest communities, including pastoralists. And the best co-option I can put, of course, there's many in all communities, there is that, but the best example of co-option is the Northern Rangelands Trust. It's called NRT. I don't know, maybe people here know, maybe they don't know. But what this is supposed to do is that it's supposed to encourage, in quotes, communities to reserve part of their lands as areas of conservation. But how this plays out is that, this organization and others go to communities and basically divide communities so that some of them are given opportunities of employment. And employment in this case normally is like to be, they call it community scouts, which are armed, and then it divides the community now to those who want to get employment and those that feel they can, use their lands and most importantly, make a decision by not being co-opted or being forced by anyone. So that one is divided. So they have one group that is always supporting whatever they are doing and not caring about the other part of the community, and the other part of the community saying this is not what we want. And when they've succeeded in putting the communities like that, it becomes easy. And then the co-option part of it is becomes easy for government, because really the co-option part of it is what the government wants. It wants somebody from, or some people from the community to say, we are happy with this, and not caring. They say the other part is really, call it a nuisance to, to conservation in this case. So I think those are just like thoughts around empowerment. And I think it's not empowerment really. I think also the word empowerment is not right. And then co-option, and the third one that I brought in. So yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much. And that's kind of dispossession disguised as conservation and empowerment that's actually used to co-opt. And yeah, whatever that third term is for that's happening. That's absolutely brilliant. Okay, and you've also given Colin a chance to arrive, and maybe you could introduce yourself if I have missed anything out, and then Kitelo can have a chance to respond to you afterwards.
Right, thank you. Yes, thank you, Kitelo. It's you've also given me some touch points to relate this talk to what you have, the situation that you described. My name's Colin Scott. I'm an anthropologist. I've worked principally with people I'll talk about now, the Crees of Iuistsi, as they call their territory. This is a territory in Quebec's, largely Quebec's resource hinterland for purposes of the Quebec economy. A portion of that territory also lies in northeastern Ontario, and a little bit in some of a significant amount, actually, the marine portion in the territory of Nunavut, which many will know as principally an Inuit territory, because of the peculiarities of Canadian political geography. This area is a territory, the territory of the Crees. Iuistsi is a territory about the size of France. The center of it would lie about 1,500 kilometers north of Montreal. It's inhabited by, today there are about 20,000 Crees resident in the territory, a very small number of non-Crees. Except on the very southern fringe of that territory, there are a few towns that were established, mainly Francophone, Canadian, Quebecois towns that were established around forestry operations and mining operations. However, and this is a kind of a 40-year trajectory of, well, 50-year now trajectory of empowerment. The Cree nation of Iuwitsi is seen often as, and would see themselves with significant pride as one of the most successful nations in terms of empowerment. So I want to relate that a little bit to what's involved in terms of cooptation, because they are empowered in ways that involve a kind of structural cooptation. That is, they've become successful players in the capitalist economy of resource extraction. And they've used the flows of resources, and they've used the political power that they've generated through opposition at some stages to government and corporate plans to build a regional economy, which is no longer by some measures, you could no longer say is principally a hunting, fishing, trapping economy, as it was in the early 1970s when this story began. At that time, the great majority of their territory was really untouched by the resource extractive designs of the state or of the companies that eventually moved in. There was a little bit of industrial forestry, a little bit of mining, again on the southern fringe of that territory. This began to change rapidly in the 1970s. And it arrived with a bang in the form of Hydro-Quebec's plan, a very extensive plan to dam every major watershed throughout the entirety of that territory of Iuwitsi. These plans were announced in 1971 or 1972. Canada was a very different world constitutionally and in policy terms in relation to Indigenous rights in the early 1970s. There was, thankfully, from the Cree's perspective, they were able to do something with this. There was a nearly 3-century tradition in Canada of making treaties with Indigenous people. And it just happened that Quebec as a provincial jurisdiction within Canada had been resistant to the treaty formula. Quebec was not the only province, that was resistant. But it meant that at the beginning of the early 70s, Crees were able to launch a legal challenge and say, we've never signed a treaty for our territory. And they were really dismissed at that time because there had not been a treaty signed in Canada since the 1920s. The kind of assimilationist doctrine was such that it was no longer necessary to sign treaties with Indigenous people. That was really the attitude at the federal and the provincial level of Canadian politics. And Crees were regarded like other Indigenous people who, in those pockets of Canada where treaties had not been signed, it was largely assumed that their rights amounted to nothing more than squatters' rights. They were not seen as title holders by any stretch. And when the Crees took the government of Quebec and Hydro-Quebec, which was a crown corporation of the provincial government, to court, it was simply assumed that this was tilting at windmills they were going to lose. And in a certain way they did lose, but what was so interesting about this moment was that in a lower court they got a positive decision, and the judge ordered an interlocutory injunction halting hydro development in the territory, and this created pandemonium and again, a dismissive attitude on the part of government, who said, you know, this decision cannot possibly stand. When it goes to the next level, to the appeals court level, the Crees are going to lose. So let's not worry too much about this. And in fact, the interlocutory injunction was not even respected. Hydro-Quebec at that time was actually the authority for that in governmental terms. They had received a kind of governmental authority for the territory. The James Bay Energy Corporation shut down the territory and continued, the bulldozers continued to work. Shut down the territory to media. There were so few ways into the territory at that time that they were able to do this. Well, that was offensive, but what happened though was that although the Crees were pretty sure that they were going to lose in the Quebec Court of Appeals, it was not so clear that they would lose at the next level of appeal, which was the Supreme Court of Canada. And that was because this episode was unfolding in the context of a first favorable precedent in the Supreme Court, and this was in 1971. It was launched by another group that had unextinguished aboriginal title, a group in British Columbia, the province of British Columbia, which, like Quebec, had done virtually no treaty making with Indigenous people. And suddenly the Quebec government and Hydro-Quebec, and more importantly, their investors on Wall Street and Bay Street, the big financial districts in the northeastern US and eastern Canada, respectively, their investors started to be worried because the Crees at the level of appeal could win a big settlement. They could conceivably win a multi-billion-dollar settlement, and this was destabilizing the certainty that financiers like when they put large sums of money. At the time, I think this was considered a $14 billion project, the first of 3 phases of developing the territory. Perhaps doesn't sound like so much money today, but that was a lot of money at that time. The long and the short of it was that the Crees forced through that process and to cut off the possibility, the threat from the investors' perspective of a Supreme Court decision that might go against them. The Crees signed a deal. They made a treaty. It was called a comprehensive claim settlement, and through it, it's more detailed than we have time for here. But it was a foothold in a process then of signing treaty after treaty over the next. Well, ever since. And this came as quite a shock, actually, because the old style treaties in Canada were kind of done and dusted kinds of things from the perspective of the state. They were largely designed to achieve the relinquishment of title, and they were very short documents with generally quite categorical language of extinguishment. There was that language in the Crees Treaty, but it was a 300-page detailed document spelling out a whole series of principles and specific rights. And what it did was set up the opportunity at every stage that the state attempted to sponsor, develop, or to encourage and license development by corporations in the territory. The Crees were able to say, but this principle has been violated, or this set of rights is not being respected. And so the Crees became experts at signing complementary and supplementary agreements time and again. There are now about 30 of them since the initial treaty in the mid-70s. The most important of those are a pair of agreements that were signed around the turn of the beginning of this century. One with the provincial government, which was required to unlock a modification to the hydro development plans for the territory, and a companion agreement with the federal government. And this pair of agreements resolved a number of long-standing concerns, grievances, and some issues about industrial forestry extraction, as well as this new hydro project, and indeed all resource extraction in the territory. And Crees came out with an agreement that they would get a significant share of resource royalty revenues for all of mining, forestry, and hydroelectricity. And a guaranteed minimum of about $5 billion over a 20-year period. Now that in Indigenous contexts in Canada or probably anywhere else, again, it feels like a lot of money. And it is a significant amount of money. It's allowed a nation of today, 20,000 people, only about 6,000, 7,000 people back in the 1970s, to invest in economic development for their communities. There are 10 communities in this region, scattered around this region. And the nature of that economy, of course, is that it's significantly engaged with, well, with the resource extractive sector, but more importantly, really, and as a bigger piece of that, it's about the service companies, generally the services sector economy, which has provided employment now for a majority of the Cree population. Unemployment rates are actually quite low in the Cree communities, which is not typical in most of Indigenous Canada. But it is an economy which has become more and more involved with the agreements that have been made directly with corporate resource extractive interests, as well as with with the state at both provincial and federal levels. Now, back in the early 70s, there was just no question from the perspective of Crees that they didn't want these forms of development. They were hunters, fishers, trappers. The service sector of that economy was very small, some very limited municipal service employment, some employment in health and education for Cree people. But about 2/3 of the population were occupationally hunters, fishers, and trappers, and gatherers. Although in the subarctic environment, gathering is not as significant as as it would be typical for foraging communities in more temperate or tropical regions. This, of course, changed over time. The kind of political commitment to opposing resource extractive development, which gave the Crees this tremendous leverage originally in legal and then calculated political terms as they built their organization. That changed in the sense that more and more Crees became reliant for their livelihoods on the flows of money that were attached to the successive agreements that they were striking with the state in the first instance, and then often with forestry companies, mining companies, Hydro-Quebec, etc. I will say, I mean, the Crees remain culturally, ideologically very committed to hunting, fishing, and trapping as what they consider traditional lifeways and livelihoods. If you look at the Cree political stance, for example, on the on protected areas, the development of parks and protected areas, they've really seized that, they've occupied that space. And thanks to the governance rights that they maintained to their lands, they did not maintain collective property rights to the majority of their lands through their treaty, but they compensated by contriving to get very substantial governance rights to the whole of their territory. And through that set of rights, they have quite vigorously defended conservation values, at the same time, juggling these at the same time with their commitments under the various development, resource extractive oriented agreements that they've negotiated. Certainly the bar is higher, the standard is higher within the Cree Nation government in terms of the percentage of their territory that they want protected. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game because the government of Quebec, of course, and within the marine area, the government of Canada are targeting higher percentages of protection these days, influenced by the Aichi targets, for example. But the Crees generally are asking for more than the governments are willing to gazette as areas under strict protection. I don't want to paint a picture of Crees having, in some sense, completely sold out, to neoliberal growth economics, but they are very much entangled with growth economics. Hunting, fishing, and trapping are not any longer an option as a kind of primary livelihood for the majority of Crees. Population has more than tripled since the early 1970s. So there's this very familiar looking political problematic now for Crees. It's not so different from what we grapple with in the mainstream, in the Canadian political mainstream. You know, how much protection are we going to give to which places, and how much will we continue to succumb to the growth demands for resource extraction to keep the money taps open. You know, to me personally, my work has been, as I mentioned, my main work has been in this area since the 1970s. I've also worked in quite a lot in Northern Australia with Torres Strait Islanders between Papua New Guinea and Queensland. And I've always worked with hunting, with the hunting sectors of these communities. It's what has really interested me, and sort of land and sea stewardship relations from the perspective of hunting and fishing peoples and livelihoods. And so that's sort of where my heart lies. And it's been to me somewhat distressing, you know, to watch elections now in Cree land, in Iwistsi, and to see that often environmental issues are way down the list of politicians' platforms. You see, you know, health, education, jobs are high on the list routinely, and you know, land and sea protection, protection for or programs to support hunters' livelihoods remain important, but they're often fourth or fifth down a kind of a list of election platform bullet points.
There's a Cree politicians you're talking about there.
The Cree politicians, yeah. I'm talking about, yeah, right. You know, also we're seeing a phenomenon of certain sort of, in quotes, co-management institutions, or institutions established to broker the benefits from some of the agreements that I've mentioned, which have a Cree face, but which are really very substantially controlled by corporate developers and or non-Cree government interests. There's this kind of codependency relationship, which can often restore a certain asymmetry. So, you know, from what kind of worries me at a deeper level, I suppose, or at the deepest level of the kind of ontology and ethos of being on the land, the kind of rich relationality that Cree hunting and fishing people continue to practice in many ways. That relationality, that vision, that way of being in the world is in significant respects just not compatible with some of the positions that are being taken by significant segments of Cree leadership, and particularly those Cree political leaders who are most entangled with the these so-called, you know, joint entities, collaborative entities.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Colin. Do you want to just wrap up?
So that, I mean, that really is where I was coming to, and that's the picture, that's the portrait that I wanted to.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely
put out there for discussion.
Thank you so much, Colin. That's absolutely fantastic, and really and pretty sad as well. So I'm just saying, conveying my feeling in response is a sadness. You know, obviously people are finding their way the best they can in a context where we're all experiencing that resource extraction model and that kind of, and then on the other hand, we're experiencing conservation in the way that Kitelo described earlier. So there's that little spaces made between that in a way for relationality to be happening. I know it's more complex than that around conservation where you are, but it's still, that's what plays out in Africa. And I know Chris here knows that from Liberia, where big palm oil happens and then other areas are taken from the community for conservation. There's actually no room for anybody in between in a way in terms of communities. I was just wondering whether, Kitelo, whether you wanted to, how is that to hear? Because that's like quite a really helpful lesson, I guess, a really helpful lesson in what can happen. And I'm just wondering what you feel hearing that.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, thanks, Collins. And it's for me, it's you know, yeah, I know the having visited, I think courtesy of you, and visited I think that was the Cree territory, where we held that cicada meeting. I think the last time I was in Canada. Not sure.
Yeah, at Wendake is.
Yes.
Yeah,
so yeah, I think I was just understanding more, because I think at that time we really did not go outside and understood the community and all that. But I think what comes out is the importance of these, sorry, these connections. You know, the learning from one community and the others, especially the indigenous communities, and because I think there's a lot of learning both ways. And what you're saying, sometimes, sorry, sometimes if you look at it and given the context, you see there's always that that normally people or indigenous communities are found in this difficult place whereby at some point when they are making some of these discussions, they discuss from a point of, call it a weak point, sorry, a weak point in the sense that the other part really is coming from a very strong point, especially coming with the financial incentives and all the things, including what you just said about the politics and how politics is shaping their, if you might call it, their future, and in a way that they are no longer kind of able to, you know, genuinely sit among themselves and make decisions that are from themselves.
So do you have that?
I think those are very, you know, yeah, those are very strong, call it, positions that indigenous peoples find themselves in, and the, you know, the 1970 of the Cree is, some communities are not even there today, some indigenous communities, and I think moving forward there is going to be quite a lot of similar stories if we don't have these cross kind of exchanges and learning from other places. This brings me to not only even forget the indigenous people, the discussions that we have sometimes in terms of colonialism, because colonialism, we normally see it as, you know, the simplistic way that, you know, Britain colonized Kenya, something like that. And you don't see the details about what caused it. And in fact, most of the people that ended up colonizing other places were themselves victims of colonialism. So it builds, it's a very good example, this one, that it's a system. It is the system of coercion, or call it you know, you rightly put it as a, you know, the capitalism. I think you mentioned that the Cree is, you know, following the capitalistic. You know, I've been co-opted. I think that is the, you know, in a nutshell what you're describing, that capitalism has sucked in the Cree nation to an extent that, you know, they can't do things. It affects, call it, it keeps on sucking everybody to it. And it's not only the Cree in this case, it's everybody. Everybody it's a system that we are not completely in control. Like in when our case, for example, the colonialism that assisted the appropriation of our lands. When the colonialists left, they left us with this system, which I think is a system of capitalism, colonialism that has been inherited and actually is playing out worse than the colonial, you know, call it the British colonial system that was there before. So it is for me, I look at it as it being a kind of system that is, today is the Cree, tomorrow it will be another indigenous community. And it is a system that we might look at it as the relationship between the Cree and the governments of Canada. But I think it's more than that. It is playing across the world. And we face this each and every other day. And I think the discussion of today, you know, the empowerment, co-option, and what I was bringing in, which is, you know, the false narratives that are built there to look like, you know, the people are doing the right things, while really in the behind it is not the case. So I think it is the learning. I think just to sum it up, I think the most important thing of some of these conversations we are having is the learning, to learn from you know, the stories like the Cree story, and to apply this not only even to indigenous peoples, but to any other, because this plays all over, everywhere. So I think that's how I can just respond to that.
So thank you so much, and thank you, Colin, too. That both of you fantastic. We've only got like 13 minutes left, so I just want to open up for comments or questions from folk here as well. Evie, I think you were making a point there in response to Kitelo, if you want to pick up on that.
It was mostly just really agreeing that the system of colonization, of domination, works in so many different ways, and you know, for some of us happened a long time ago and has been, you know, really deeply rooted in us. But it's painful. It's like, it's not fun, and it needs to be healed. And I think, you know, just kind of building this sense from spending this week, and I guess the work that we've done before as well, of the need for sort of processes that can connect and heal us, but also, like you were saying, of connecting between us, even if our situations look quite different, that with you know, sensitivity and respect, there's a huge amount that we can learn from one another and share. So yeah, just really appreciating what you're bringing, both of you.
And I saw Heather, I think, and Mama also putting stuff in the chat. I don't know if you want to raise any of your points.
Yeah, the kind of people being asked to negotiate from a place of oppression when you don't have equality, and kind of, for me, I don't know what happens. It's what are people's needs? Are they ever documented? Are they part of the conversation, whereas the government can come around and appropriate land as and when it feels like. So there's not an equality there. And I'm kind of wondering, Peter, whether the Greenbelt movement is still active in Kenya, and whether they're still kind of trying to, you know, support forests and things.
That is a question to me.
Yes, about the Greenbelt movement, because Wangari did a lot of work, whether that's kind of an organization that's still trying to protect forests and people's right to live off the land.
I think in the Green Belt movement in Kenya, I've not interacted with it much because they are not in the land rights movement. They come from the perspective of you know, conservation, and not a rights-based kind of approach. That could be the reason why, you know, I've not really like worked or gotten a lot of work with them, because I think in a nutshell, that is how a rights-based approach that we try to, you know, advocate and work for and bring it as the new way of doing things is not a politically correct. And most of the organizations in countries like Kenya and many others, especially those who do conservation, see it as a conflict, that you cannot be asking for land rights and these land rights supporting conservation. It's still, many people still struggle with that. And I would imagine, I haven't had them or come across them in many of the forests that we do, or in like the policy proposals that we make. So I would imagine. I only know them of one that we agree with, and is the promotion of farming in gazetted forests.
Yes, I heard Wangari
Thank you.
I heard Wangari Maathai in COP in Copenhagen, where she was speaking very strongly for reparations from the global north, but it was kind of to governments in the global south. It wasn't the rights aspect for communities, really wasn't in there at all. So it's this thing where we get it translated in that intermediary language that Kitelo was referring to, that middle bit where our good intentions become something pretty appalling if we allow it to be controlled by a system that's designed to appropriate. So yeah, she was obviously well-intentioned, but she was really feeding that narrative, and I'll leave that. Any other questions or thoughts? Larry, you're looking at that.
Yeah, just to maybe a reflection that in gatherings such as this, to what extent are we also reflecting about the similar processes taking place in the lands in which we are in and interact with here in the global north? Because of course politics of the global south also happen here at home in the UK. So there are communities of global southern people here who are affected by similar kinds of processes. So I mean, people may be aware of the young child who died and who was the first person in the world to be, or at least in the UK, to be have on their death certificate environmental pollution as the reason for their death. So there are all kinds of dispossessions that take place here, and people's access to the countryside. I mean, there are very few instances of people who are from the global south having access to green space in this country in a way that is similar to their peers. So I think it's quite useful to have that reflection, because it helps us to understand the lens that we're using to look at other places, and so that we can have more insight in how we're actually looking and otherizing those other places in which we have, obviously, as Kitelo has spoken about, have historical investment in producing. So, you know, working in West Africa, West Central Africa, and the same organization that Kitelo spoke about, running projects that are supposed to be pro-community forestry, but in forests which colonially the British have terribly exploited and, you know, started to grow teak and melina and these kinds of things. So I think we perhaps, yeah, it's just good to reflect, to look at ourselves in the mirror before we take that mirror to project narratives that are further away. And I want to introduce a term here to think about this term, colonial time. The idea that the further one is away from the idea of a central or more civilized place, the further one is away in terms of being modern and having mental, physical, political equipment to deal with a situation of injustice. And I just want us to kind of reflect on those kind of modalities that we may be introducing to how we are understanding the situations that Colin and Kitelo have described.
Great, thank you. We just have a few minutes, so maybe if anybody has a last question, if they could be reasonably quick with it. Joe, I think you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Justin. It will be very quick. Yeah, I actually have lots to say, but I will say it. Just one important thing. When we say the British colonized and the British did this and did that, and the Americans are doing this in the Middle East, the responsibles for it are not mentioned, right? If you ask someone, a British person, you did this, you killed all these people in this country, you blah, blah. No, I don't. No, I didn't. And what about your grandfather? No, he didn't. So what about your community? They agree with that? No, nobody agreed with that. Yeah. So most of the people in all these, what we call colonial countries, are against it. Who did this? Is the rulers and so on and so forth. So it would be interesting to change the narrative and say, instead of saying the British did this, but the elite or the ruler at that time push this to happen in this way because of profit, so on and so forth. Thank you.
So great to hear your voice, Joe. I didn't realize that was you. Can we just have the last few minutes for Colin and Kitelo just to say whatever they want? Colin, do you want to come back a bit?
Well, I guess on Joe's comment, you know, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a sister-in-law, well, with my family in Saskatchewan, who were the sort of a long line of peasants and farmers from in this extended peregrination. It also reminds me of sort of history and colonial time, you know, but from Scotland to Ireland, Northern Ireland, from there to Quebec, from Quebec to Ontario, and always pushing westward, and always the surplus children in these, you know, humble farming families getting pushed out to the next frontier. And, you know, I said in a conversation with some of my family, you know, I referred to the theft of Indigenous land where we were born and raised. And one of my sisters-in-law, who had a, you know, similar family history, said, my grandparents didn't steal land from anyone.
Can you say that again, Colin? Sorry, maybe just me that missed.
My grandparents and great-grandparents did not steal land from anyone. You know, so, you know, who's to take responsibility? She might have agreed after some discussion that the federal government of John A. Macdonald stole land from the Assiniboine people whose lands our farms were on. You know, I thought about it later. I wasn't about to have a family argument over it, but what if I had said to her, okay, our great grandparents did not steal the land, but we paid the taxes and elected the politicians who were responsible for stealing the land, paid the taxes that the Northwest Mounted Police were supported by in establishing a military presence on Indigenous lands. I guess it's a question of, you know, ownership of these collective realities, and I think that this you know, facing up to the way in which all of us are subjects of colonialism and coloniality, and to the need for, and what I find tremendously such vitality in this kind of reworlding idea and the way you're approaching it, is that it can only be through interpeople's alliances, coming to grips with what will be a better life. I think that some of the Latin American scholarship in emphasizing buen vivir, living well, is very good in that way, because it, in an interesting way, it just brings it down to the common denominator that all of us are seeking richer, more meaningful lives. Mm. And so many of us understand that we don't get that. We're not achieving that through acquiescence or through permitting cooptation to take us down. It's a complicated and it's a long-term conversation, yeah. But it's the work before us.
That's wonderful, Colin. Thanks so much. So let's stop permitting acquiescence to the degree we can. And Kitelo, do you want a last word? We need to wrap up because people need to go, but do you want to just...
Yeah, I think for me, this discussion about power, corruption, and call it misinformation, or yeah, that other one. I think there's need for space for genuine, call it taking over of power from genuine, you know, genuine people, because there's a lot of the people in power. We normally have the people in power majorly come in, and they are not coming for our interest or the interest of everybody, but coming for the interest of themselves. So how can the people that have the interest for everyone come to power? And I think that is a discussion everywhere. And I think if we can have an answer for that or resolve that, I think makes other things easy. Else the discussions would be on the periphery. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to need to stop. We've got exactly that session at 5 o'clock UK time today. So if you want to come back and join us for that very question. We shouldn't acquiesce, but we should also see that there are systems of power that force us to acquiesce. So we shouldn't just blame ourselves, but we need to take responsibility, is what I'm hearing in that too. So thank you all. If you want to open your mics and say thanks or whatever, then just thank you so much, Colin, and thank you so much, Kitelo. Fantastic.
Thank you, Kitelo.
Thank you.
Justin,
Thank you.
and everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Oh.